well. So let's get started. One of the things that we think of when we think of conversational skills is really how, as adults, how probably we just learned this incidentally, and we don't realize how complex conversation skills really are. There are many different things that go into having a conversation, and I think that if we think about our daily lives and how many conversations we have, it just comes fluidly or naturally. But there are a lot of skills that are involved when it comes to conversation. And so on the screen, you'll see just a few of those and to really look at how complex conversational skills are and how that might be a challenge. We're going to discuss that on the next slide. Some of the things are initiating a conversation. So just how do you get started in a conversation? What are some of those conversation starters? And we do that, again, very naturally, and we've probably learned that incidentally growing up, where that might be a challenge for folks with autism spectrum disorder. It might not come naturally. And just when do I start a conversation? What is something that I say to start a conversation? Topic selection. This is a big one because many individuals with autism spectrum disorder may have a real high interest area, and so that might be the topic that they choose to discuss and continually discuss, and sometimes we say kind of perseverate on that. And so how do we pick a topic that is sort of a mutually agreeable topic that we'll both be interested in, so both sides of that conversation? That can be a real challenge. They may insert themselves into a conversation as well. So sometimes, biting into a conversation when they weren't yet part of that group, that might be an area as well that we need to kind of look at and see how can we work on those skills. Engaging in a monologue, going on and on, again, about that topic of interest. That's an area as well. We have to take turns when we're speaking. We have to be the listener, and we also have to be the speaker at times. And when do you do that? When is it appropriate? Kind of attending to those body language and facial expressions will be really critical in conversation skills, so we know when to do that. And believe me, I feel like this time using virtual and the social distancing aspect, and then also that virtual piece, that makes it even more tricky because we don't always see all the folks, or we're not seeing them, maybe we're seeing them with a mask. And so again, thinking about how complex that can be, that we don't get to really read how someone's facial expressions are if they're wearing a mask, or I can't necessarily see all my classmates on Zoom. So I'm not really sure of those body language and facial expressions. Answering and asking questions, that's a big area as well. So again, having kind of that right exchange of how many questions do you ask someone else instead of just answering questions and it all being kind of all about you. Multitasking, it takes a lot. We have to block out distractions when we're having conversations. Again, we're doing a lot of these same skills almost simultaneously and not really thinking about it. So it takes a lot of multitasking as well to engage in conversations. So we already talked about some of the challenges already that an individual with autism may experience. Some of these include, again, those brief responses. I give you a quick answer back. I'm not really sure how to elaborate on that response or that topic. That off-topic speech. So you may be talking about one area, one topic, and then all of a sudden an individual may kind of insert themselves and discuss something completely off topic that came out of sort of nowhere. That lack of sharing information, so sort of that perspective taking, also where I have an idea and you have an idea, they kind of come together. So that back and forth of sharing information. There may be very few conversational exchanges. So where it seems very brief, we're kind of caught off, or we don't have that kind of that ratio of back and forth of listener to speaker and having that back and forth. They may not ask questions to keep that conversation going, which results in limited conversation exchanges, right? That's going to kind of stop the conversation. And again, engaging in that monologue, and it limits the other person's opportunity to speak. So again, other people may not want to engage in a conversation where it's a monologue and they don't have the opportunities to speak. They may have difficulty observing their conversation partner or monitoring the conversation. Again, talking about those body language and those nonverbal cues that we have to be in tune with. So why practice conversational skills? Why is this important? Well, if we think about in our daily lives, both in work, social, and so forth, we use conversation all the time, and it limits the opportunities for people with ASD to engage in social reciprocity in those interactions if they have limited or deficits in conversation skills, which then may interfere with developing friendships and relationships, which is critical. We know we all have a sense of belonging. We all want to belong, and we all want to connect with individuals and have those friendships and those social relationships. And so this could interfere with that. Also, it increases the likelihood of social withdrawal and isolation, which is really unfortunate. But we see this if we look at some of the research showing that because of limited conversation skills, not being able to develop those relationships, that we can that individuals can sometimes feel isolated and withdraw. And so it's really important that since we know that one of the deficit areas or characteristics of ASD are some type of impact when it comes to social communication, we want to make sure that we provide interventions and instruction around this area in order to improve those skills. So what are some prerequisites? We're going to talk specifically about some prerequisites for sort of working on these conversational skills. There are lots of prerequisites that before you can get into that level of conversation when you look at language and language development. But what we're talking about are some basic prerequisites that your child or the youth needs to have before you begin using these language games. So one of the main areas is motivation. You got to make it fun. Often we're not going to, if we think of our own lives, we're not going to attend to something and remain engaged in something that's not motivating to us. And so children and youth with autism spectrum disorder are going to be just the same. You've got to add that child's interest into the game, make it fun, have a reward for participating. We don't necessarily see that all folks find social communication rewarding. Because it may be a difficult skill. So we want to make it fun and rewarding. You might base that reward on the amount of time the child engages, the number of turns, or any number of criteria that meet the needs of the child. Some of the basic skills that you would be required before you kind of can work on those conversation skills is, if in thinking of the games that Charlene's going to introduce in a little bit, in order to play these games, your child must have some basic language skills, such as being able to request his needs, request information, and comment. So before you're able to kind of work on those conversation skills, thinking about those early learning or those emerging skills, you would want those to be in place first before you jump up to kind of working on conversations. And there are lots of prerequisite skills that lead up to that, including that functional communication, what we would call. And then the next area would be having a communication system. So the person must have a means to communicate. So the child must have a mode of communication, whether that's verbally, but also it may include other things such as an AAC device, picture exchange, sign language, so forth. So whatever modality, making sure that the child or youth has access to that while you're trying to work on or help support these skills. And so I'm going to turn it over to Charlene to get us started on looking at just some of these things, some of these games that can be incorporated.
Okay, we're going to talk about the games now. Most of these games, in fact, all of them at some point or another, I've worked with groups of students with autism, and they've been very successful. In your current situation right now, and I'm speaking mostly to parents, you may be supporting your child or your youth in their academic work because we've got teachers that can't be with the kids all the time. So knowing that you have very, very busy lives, we thought these games would be really helpful to show you because these games work on those kind of foundational skills that underlie the ability to have a conversation. So if your teacher's working on actually teaching conversation, working on these skills with your child, with your youth, may very well help strengthen those underlying skills. So that's what you're going to see in these games. You might want to touch base with the teacher just to see what conversation skills or what speech and language skills they're working on right now, so you can kind of match them to where your child is. These are games you can play anywhere and at any time. So the more you make it fun, the more you make it spontaneous, the more likely you're going to have your child be willing to participate in it. You can include other family members in these games and friends or other siblings or peers. In fact, with some of the games, the more the merrier, because it gets to be a lot of fun. You can add these games to your daily routine. Some of them might be really appropriate to play at dinner time when you have your whole family there. Maybe traveling in the car. You can maybe think of other times during the day when these games would be appropriate. The important thing is the games have to be fun. You don't want to be dragging your child into doing something that they don't like, because you really won't get a good result from that. So I'm including a document. There's going to be a handout, and the handout actually describes the games in detail and also gives some virtual ideas on how to play these games with kids. If you're not the parent and you're actually trying to do this remotely, you'll be able to download that handout after we're finished with our session, and it should be on our website, and you'll get more information about that. Let's start with the first game. It's called Conversation Game. And this game really helps your student practice the back and forth that Stephanie was talking about, that reciprocity that we're so used to in our conversational exchanges with each other. The idea of this game is the child's going to ask you or another person a question and then wait for a response. After that, the person that they ask the question of is going to respond to their question, and they're going to then take their turn asking the question. And it's going to go back and forth that way between the student and whoever he is having this conversation with. This back and forth, usually we do it for a specific period of time, and you may want to make it fairly short at the beginning and do it more times during the day or during the week, whatever your schedule is like, and slowly maybe add some time to it. You can use visuals, and I'm going to promote visuals throughout this whole training today to remind your child of what he needs to do. And you'll see it on the handout when you get that. I usually use cards that say question, comment, response, and wait. And for a lot of our kids, that's enough cue for them. For some, you may actually have to touch the card so that they know what part of that conversation they're involved in right at that particular point in time. And the purpose of this activity is to successfully master that back and forth exchange. So it doesn't really matter at this point whether the student is sticking to one topic or not. So you may cover a number of different topics, and that's perfectly okay. So once you get this kind of basic back and forth going, you can eventually branch out from this. So you can put additional requirements on the people playing the game, such as you have to stick to one topic. And if I'm doing that, and for the whole exchange, and then eventually you change. So if I'm doing that, I might use a visual cue card or a whiteboard or something so that you can write the topic up, and everybody who's in that exchange knows what topic they should be discussing. You can also tell your child or youth that he may only ask questions about the partner. Some of our students will ask information questions or fact questions that are really only about what their passion is, right? What they're really interested in. So by saying they've got to think about the other person in the exchange and ask them something that's really relevant to them, puts an added challenge into this game for our students. So again, you want to make sure your child is progressing at the different levels of this first. And if you move up slowly, you'll start to see that conversation starts to become more and more elaborate and interesting. Stephanie talked about rewards, and you might want to think about a reward system for your child. Really depends on how well they enjoy the game, whether you really need to use it or not. But you may either look at time increments, so we're going to keep it going back and forth for a minute or 2 minutes, or you may want to look at adding the restrictions that I talked about, where you have to stay on topic or really think about your partner before you participate. But you want to make sure you only do one new thing at a time. So if you decide to go to the more advanced questions, then you want to make sure that you do that, and then maybe add increasing the time a little bit further on. So you don't want to do 2 things at once that are different, only one new thing at a time. So the second game on this page is called Newspaper Reporter. In this activity, your child becomes a newspaper or TV reporter, and they ask a certain set of questions to whoever they're interviewing, which if it's your child, it may be you that they're interviewing. You can make up that set of questions ahead of time. And for a lot of our kids, we need to do that. We need to give them the visual cues or the visual script of what those questions are for them to be successful at this. And then of course, you would answer their questions. You can kind of change this a little bit by letting the child tell you what questions that they want to ask. And so you can write those down and make sure that they still have the script. Eventually, they may not need that visual script, but for right now, that might be very, very helpful. You can use questions such as, what is your name? What do you do for a living? What's your favorite TV show? And there's a number of other ones. So really whatever strikes your fancy. And the goal here is to get your child familiar with asking questions, which in turn increases the give and take of a conversation. So if you haven't mastered the question part, your conversations with people are going to be pretty short. So after your child masters this very basic skill, then you can have him generate his own questions, as I said. You can talk about what's appropriate and what's an inappropriate question to ask certain people. So you can kind of think about different people in your child's life and decide whether those questions are appropriate to ask that person or not. Some of our kids, when they learn to ask questions, just kind of ask the same questions of everybody, and it can get you into a sticky situation. You may want to watch TV and watch a news show together so you can see what kind of questions do newspaper and TV reporters ask. So that would really help expose your child to different types of questions. So that's another way of looking at it. You can eventually ask for more probing questions, and usually you'd want to be playing this game quite a while before you did that. To make this fun, you can use a plain microphone. And many times we don't have a microphone, but there are a lot of things in your house that would look kind of like a microphone, a wooden spoon, really anything that the student can hold and pretend that that's his microphone. You could also make this even more interesting by having the person being interviewed to be a character that your child really, really enjoys. So possibly you are going to be Batman and your child's going to interview you as Batman. What would you ask Batman and what would Batman say? And you could switch it the other way around too, where you're the interviewer and your child is the character and you're asking him questions. What's good about that is that you really the child gets a chance to hear what kind of questions you ask, so you can be modeling some of the appropriate questions. So again, we can make it really fun, and we can take turns doing either role. So this next group of games fall under the heading of improvisation. And this is a great way to give a child the opportunity to practice a number of things at one time. So processing language, using language, attending to nonverbal cues, and also using nonverbal cues in conversation, and body language. And also when you're talking to a partner or working with a partner, responding quickly and thinking quickly to come up with a response. And a number of those tend to be difficult for our child. So we many times will kind of work on one or two of these at a time rather than trying to do the whole shebang all at once. So we're asking the child to do something we call multitasking, and Stephanie talked about that. That tends to be difficult, and it also tends to be one of the reasons that our students really have trouble with those social communication situations. There's a lot of things happening all at one time. So we're going to work on that with the child by doing fun things. Your child may also need more processing time at the beginning playing some of these games than we would typically expect of us in a conversation, but that's okay. The more you play the game, the shorter that processing time is going to get, and that's going to really help your student learn again to do these things without having that big delay in there. So the first game we're going to talk about is free association. And the way we play this game is one player says a word, any word, and you may want to let your child do it first, or you may want to do it first. It really doesn't matter. The next player then responds to that first word with the first word that comes to mind for him. And it's a little harder sometimes than you think it is. But the quicker that they can come up with a word to associate with the word you said, the more we're working on some of those processing skills becoming more flexible. So you can continue this for a minute or two. If you're playing with more than two people, then each person can keep it going. So if you tell your child a word, he responds with a word, then the person sitting next to him is going to respond to his word. So we just keep those words building throughout this activity. The goal is to say, again, the first thing that pops into your mind. It's fun to write down the first word that you started with, and then the very last word that was said before you end the game, and then talk a little bit about how we got from table to cloud. So, because it gets really interesting as we go through this activity. So I'm going to just demonstrate real quickly with Stephanie. That's okay. The word I'm going to say is pizza.
Pepperoni.
Ah. And if she says pepperoni, I may say cheese.
Pizza Hut.
There you go. So, and a lot of times we really go way far off from that first topic. So the more we played, the more variety we get in there. So that's kind of what the game looks like. The skills here, I'm just going to go over them real quickly, are flexibility, speed by which you responded. Our kids tend to get stuck a little bit in one way of associating ideas, and this slowly breaks down that mental rigidity. And again, if you have a number of people playing, then the child gets to hear how other people respond to that word, which may be different than he might have responded, and then that's okay. There are no correct responses in this game, which makes it fun. The next game is Trivia Ball. This game can be played with partners or small to medium-sized group. And again, the goal is to think quickly of an item that's based on the description of the category that we're going to be talking about. But you also have to catch a ball at the same time. And so we are talking about, and think of who you want to throw the ball to when your turn is over. So we're talking again about some multitasking in this, which includes some motor work, which is always interesting. So it helps to have an adult leader who starts out, and then you can switch to that when your child's ready to lead. The leader has the ball and calls out a category. The category I'm thinking about would be things that fly. So you toss the ball to the student and say things that fly, and then he has to come up with something that fits that category, like bird or airplane. He has the ball. He then looks for somebody in the circle, or if it's just the two of you, throws the ball back to you, and then he may be able to say a category. If not, then you can just do the category for a while until he gets the hang of it. So if we're staying in that same category, and I said things that fly, and my student said plane, then when it came back to me, I might say butterfly. So you can see, you can keep it going around the circle, coming up with as many things that fly as you guys can possibly do. After a minute or so, the leader, whoever started the activity, is going to end that category. And you do it with some kind of sound or word or whatever. I usually use ding, 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 and I say new category, and then I say what the next category is going to be. And students have to then think quickly, kind of change their mindset at that point to think about the new category, which might be, tell me one word that describes pumpkin. And so now we've gone from flying to pumpkin, And our kids have got to then switch their thinking a little bit. And the other thing that this does is it helps our kids accept change. Many times when we're playing this game, I'll go ding, 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 and somebody will say to me, oh, I had a good one. That's good, that's great, but we're still gonna move on. It's accepting that it's now changed and now you've gotta get out of that mode and think about the next category. But it tends to be a lot of fun, and kids start to be very, very good at this game after a while, which is great, wonderful. Mirrowing is the next one on this page. And this involves two people, and you can divide up into different groups of two people if you've got more than just you and your child. You have to observe your partner very closely, which our students tend not to do when in a conversation. And you have to imitate what you see very quickly and stay up with your partner. Now, the partner himself is going to be kind of monitoring the student to make sure that they're keeping with them too. So some of the skills addressed are observation of another person, sharing with a partner, and being part of a team. So there are a lot of good skills that work with this. And you've got that nonverbal that you're attending to. So you're not attending to language anymore, you're attending to body language, facial expression, and anything in between that the kids come up with. So each partner has 1 to 3 minutes to keep the action and imitation going, and then you can adjust the time as needed. After about the first 3 minutes, we then change the leader. So if you're the leader and your child is imitating you, then set a timer or set a time, and when that goes off, then it switches. Your child is the leader and you have to imitate him. So we go back and forth with that, which is really, really nice. The kids tend to enjoy that activity. The last activity, the last game on this slide is called Yes and this is a very interesting one. We're actually getting a little more complex as we kind of move through these games. The goal of this activity is to have your participants add to rather than controlling the language exchanges. And for a lot of our guys that when we hear from parents and teachers too, they say, well, they can talk perfectly well. They just want to talk about what they want to talk about. And so this really forces you to listen to what the last person has said and respond to that, not to what your inner drive tells you would be interesting to talk about. So one person makes a statement, and the statement, we've got a pizza theme going here today. The statement might be, pizza is the best food ever. And then the next person has to think about what that person said. And they also need to make a statement, but their statement has to start with yes. So you agree with your partner, and then you add a comment or add a thought that connects to what your partner has just said to you. So it might be, yes, and I get my pizza from Pizza Hut. And then the next person also has to say yes and respond to, I get my pizza from Pizza Hut. So as you go along, you're going to see these all relate to each other, but they may move in different directions, which makes it very interesting. So the skills here are really listening to what's said. You've got to pay attention to what the person beside you or in front of you has just said. And our kids tend to not do that. If they're thinking and they're really trying hard to communicate, they're thinking about what they might say. So you really got to take that time out and think about what the other person said. They have to process the language and create language that adds to the idea. And do all these skills simultaneously, which is, again, that multitasking may be a little bit difficult. So I'm going to demonstrate with Stephanie real quickly. And it's raining outside today.
Yes, and it's not windy.
Yes, and I'm hoping it's going to be windy tomorrow so I can fly my kite. So you can see we agreed with each other, and then we kind of acknowledged what that person had said, but then added our own thing to it. And that makes it a fun game for the kids. So this slide talks about something called story cubes. And I don't know, I put a picture up here of what the box looks like and what the cubes look like. In the store, they're called Rory's Story Cubes. And what we tend to think about is many times when you're having a conversation with somebody, one or both of you may actually tell a story. And we've got to think about what those behaviors are. If your partner is telling a story, how do you respond to that? And then how do you tell your own story that may be related to his story? So we're getting pretty complex when you get up to story cubes. But this is a really fun game to practice those skills with. They have to do things like practice telling a story. They have to incorporate specific elements into their part of the story. And they have to listen very carefully, process a storyline, so you can add to it, and then verbally add your part of the story. Sometimes we do use a prompt with this particular game. And what will happen is I'll summarize the story so far for a certain student who may not have been with us as long, or maybe just struggling a little bit with all those kind of skills we've asked. So I'll summarize what's happened so far, and then have that student respond, and then I'll take his response and describe how I would add that to the story. And that really does help a lot. And pretty quickly, those guys that are just learning these concepts start coming up with some really interesting additions of their own. So Rory Story Cubes you can buy at Walmart, Target, really anywhere, and they come in different kinds. It's a 6-sided cube, and on each of the sides, there's a little picture. And the pictures are pretty abstract. Sometimes I have to ask the kids, what do you think this is? Because they don't always look exactly what you think they might look like. I put the cubes in a hat or in a little bowl, and then I put enough so that each person has a choice between 2 or 3 cubes. We pass the bowl around, they take their cube out, they look at all the sides, they pick the picture that they're going to use with their part of the story, and they put it down in front of them so we can all see the pictures. And then we decide who's going to begin the story. When we first started playing this game, we would have one of our leaders start the story and use the picture that he was showing as part of his story. And then each child in the group, in turn, adds a piece to that story and uses his picture as part of his story. So the last person in the group then wraps the story up using his picture in the wrap-up. Students become very, very good at this. They're very interested in what the story is going to be like when it gets to them. And they're very interested in what happens after they give their part of the story. How's that story going to end? And we've had some pretty incredible stories over the years. It's also fun to record these stories and let the kids listen to them back to see what the story was like when they're not on the spot trying to come up with some part of that story. So that's a great way to build those storytelling cues or storytelling skills into your student, but also blend in those skills of what do I do if I'm a listener? So those are important too. Role playing is the next one on this list. And really that's just acting out a situation in a very structured way. So you can write a script for a role play. It can be very short. You can just come up with a problem statement, and I'm going to show you how that's done, so that your student has to think about, well, in this problem, what would I say to the other person? And you can also let your child develop a script with you, and that's always fun to do. I included a few situations on the handout, so you'd have kind of some things to think about if you wanted to do this. Sometimes your child can play the role of the child or the youth or the whatever in the role play. Sometimes the child plays the role of the parent, and that kind of helps a little bit with our kids really thinking about the perspective of somebody else. What would my parent, as a parent, what would I say? So it kind of adds a little bit of extra interest into it. Sometimes what we do is we can do things like acting out emotions, doing the role plays. We can solve problems. We can interact with another person. We can look at appropriate social distancing. If you're the parent and you are in physical proximity to your child, you can talk about, well, how close would we stand in order to have this conversation? Especially if you're pretending that they're not speaking with their parent. Some of our kids feel very comfortable getting very near us when they talk, but you wouldn't do that same behavior with somebody you didn't know as well. Look at an eye contact. We can look at waiting for another person to stop speaking before you start speaking. So sometimes that's a skill that our kids really need to work on. So one example I came up with was you're upset because your friend can't come over to play and you're speaking to your mom. So if you wanted to role play that, you could be the mom or the dad, your child could be the child, and you can have that conversation and then switch roles and do it a different way. Role playing a conversation about the problem can be very effective. Videotaping, and you've heard me talk about videotaping the story cubes, but it's fun to include videotaping really anytime you're playing any of these games. Your child, your family, anybody participating in the games, and then let your child view it later. And you can make comments on, well, how did so-and-so do with this? And, you know, are we doing it the way we talked about? Or, you know, how would you critique this particular video? And so you can have that discussion. What went well? What didn't go so well? And what would we change the next time? And sometimes it's just fun to watch the videos just for fun, because they are fun to watch. I want to talk just a little bit about visual supports, because you've heard me say we use visual supports when we're doing these games. My feeling on visual supports to prompt students with autism, especially at the beginning of playing these games and learning how to do these skills, is visuals all the time, everywhere. So you can't have enough of them. They really help. Visual cues, visual scripts, and the videotaping, all of that is really cueing into how our kids learn. They're visual learners. So if we can include that in the games, it really helps them be successful. Just be sure your child continues to improve in playing each of the games we talked about. As you fade the use of prompts, you may be prompting them to look at the visual. You may not want to fade the visual, or eventually your child may not use the visual anymore and you can just drop it out. And that's good too. You always want to make sure your child feels successful at playing the game, or she or he is not going to feel very motivated to want to participate next time you play. The final word on playing these games is have fun. The more fun and the sillier it is, the more the kids want to participate in it. And so that tends to be a motivator all by itself. So I talked a little bit about doing these in the virtual world for those of you who might be working with students remotely. And these are some of the tips that we've learned in working with our kids remotely. You have to have a way to show people are going to take turns and whose turn it is next. We use the popsicle sticks with the names on it in a cup, and then we just pull it out at random, and whoever's name's on the stick, it's their turn. So you can do something like that. You can actually teach your students to use the raise hand icon if you have that on your learning management system. You can draw names from a can, like I said. You can also think about methods for your child or your student to choose somebody else in the group. In order to do that, you might want to teach them the chat box feature so that they can put the name in the chat box. You may also want to send a roster of names of the students home to the student you're working with, because many times our kids recognize the other people in the group, but they may not remember their name. So that really helps them put a name to a student. And, or they can call out the name. So there's lots of different ways of doing it, but make sure you think through that turn taking. Again, make sure they learn each other's names. That's a really important issue right there. You want to communicate to your families about any item or prop that may be needed for a game. We didn't have very many in the games I talked about, but sometimes you may need something like that. And so make sure that they know ahead of time what they need. I include their interest areas as favorite topics in many of these games. And so we want to make sure we understand and know what the preferences are for the students you're working with. Using visuals, sometimes we use the visuals by just holding them up. And other times we actually send the visual home so the student can have it at their learning desk and use that. And using the platform, we actually found out real quickly we had to teach the platform, and it got kind of tricky at times because we may not exactly know the device that our student had at the other end, but we worked it out. So making sure they know how to raise their hand, to chat box, and to do polls and things like that. And then Stephanie talked a little bit about rewards. That's the way that you can really make sure that your kids are engaged and paying attention. For things like that, we really make sure that we've given the kids some choices. And a lot of times we'll give our group choices, they'll vote on it at the beginning of the session. And then if everybody has followed the rule, and we do set 2 or 3 rules for all of our virtual sessions. And so if everyone has followed the rules, then they get whatever that reward was at the end. We also use choice boards quite a bit and let our kids choose, for instance, what game to play, or what song we're going to sing, or again, we talked about the reward system. So having choice in here, even though some of the games actually do have choice blended into them, is really, really important. And again, the visuals, already talked about that. Sometimes we've made a video of how to play the game and send it home ahead of time so that the parents can introduce it to the child and it's not brand new to them. And I think that would be very helpful too. I've described lots of other virtual ideas in the handout that may be helpful if you're trying to do this in the virtual world. So here are just a few of the virtual ideas we used to help our kids with understanding what was going on in our sessions and structure it. On the slide, you see the handout that says Joy of Acting at the top. And that handout has a check-in for emotions. You know, how are you feeling today? And we have the kids respond numerous ways. Sometimes we just do a count on fingers. Other times we have them tell us, just all kinds of different ways to respond to that. You can see the 2 rules that we have. And we also put in here what you'll need for today, where we put in any kind of homework item we have asked them to work on. We might put in the Zoom link as a reminder, just anything else that they might need. We also put in the schedule. So today's schedule is on there, and maybe what the topics are that we'll be working on. And then there's a blank space that doesn't show up quite as much as it is on the slide, where they can write down ideas that they have, or write down responses before they say them, or write whatever they want in them. So we actually send this home, but you could use this as a backdrop to your virtual world, and that would be helpful too. Just change it as we get to different things. We also found really quickly last spring that we needed a way of telling our kids to unmute their microphones. So you see our little unmute picture. It actually didn't look as fancy as this because we had to make one as we were going along, and then we finally got a little fancier. And then this is, again, the choices we talked about, and having a set way of doing that with the kids. So whichever of these games you play or are interested in, whether you're doing it virtually or whether you're doing it in person, I hope you enjoy the games and have a lot of fun with them. We enjoyed them when we play with our kids.
Okay, so I guess we're ready now for our live chat. Were you going to say something, Stephanie?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
I thoroughly enjoyed the session today. It was a lot of fun.
Great.
Lots of great ideas. So I believe I think Lucian has already posted the handout for today that I think Charlene referenced on the site. There is an evaluation form. So yeah, so he has, Lucian has just put the link for getting the handouts for today.
And we also always post our PowerPoints within a week or so, Nikki, I guess?
Yep.
Yeah.
And again, today's session was recorded, so that will also be posted to our site. If there's something that you wanted to share with a colleague, they could just go in and they weren't unable to attend the session today. Can anybody hear that baby in the background?
Yes.
Okay, that's my granddaughter.
Aww.
I'm sitting here going, Alan Feeder, Alan Feeder. That's my husband. How can the story cubes be purchased? Charlene?
There are, I think, 3 or 4 different sets of them, and I found them at Walmart, and I've also found them at Target.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and it's called Rory's Story Cubes, RORY''S. But they're great. They're so much fun.
Yeah, I think the point was it's nice that you don't have to go through Amazon for everything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. In the before world, I hardly ever used Amazon.
Yeah, there is the before world.
I've gone the really low-tech way before when I was a classroom teacher and actually made the cubes.
Ah.
You know,
Oh.
it wasn't real difficult. I'm not very artsy or crafts, so it was very simple. But that's another option if you want to kind of do a low-tech way or not have to purchase them. You could always make the cubes and then kind of find some topic areas and so forth as far as what you put on them.
If it's just the 2 of you, you might want to make a cube like Stephanie says and just put 6 pictures on there and then just roll the cube. Whichever picture comes up, that's your picture. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this.
So Charlene and Stephanie, there's been a request that maybe there'd be a future session on ways to help early speech skills. Teachers, many of her students are nonverbal when they start.
Yeah.
That's a really good topic area and question.
Yeah.
Charlene and I have discussed maybe, later, maybe possibly doing something that addresses that so that you can get those prerequisite skills in order to get to the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, so now you've got more work to do. Good.
Suggestion.
And have you used conversation games with children? This is from Karen, from children like 2 or 3-year-old children?
You can do it as long as they've got those prerequisite skills.
Okay.
You could probably simplify a few of these, but you got to look developmentally at whether kids are ready to ask questions or understand questions and things like that. But if you've got a student that is on top of all those prerequisite skills, there's absolutely no way you shouldn't be able to do some of these games.
Excellent. I'm glad Addie likes the sound of the baby because it doesn't seem to be stopping.
That's how babies communicate, right?
That's a very strong communication skill here, and she's saying she's hungry. Hopefully Grandpa is as in tuned. So there was another question here too about how do you help students that are nonverbal? Do you want to spend just a few minutes talking about that? I know you said about the prerequisite skills, but do you want to elaborate?
Well, the first thing, we'd have to also know, is this person nonverbal, but they have another means of communicating? So are they using a picture system, or are they nonverbal and there's no communication except, their behavior? Makes a difference in how we would proceed. But one of the first things we would start working on with a student who did have a way of communicating and teaching it would be to look at things that they really wanted to make sure that they learned how to request them. That's kind of where we would start first. Requesting and labeling a few items. So those are your first really important steps. Steph, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on it as well. Regardless of, what mode of communication, using that mode of communication, the other thing is that motivation piece, right? I'm not going to probably do some of these back and forth or turn taking or some of those, more basic prerequisite skills unless I'm motivated. So using that really like what is the interest and strengths in going there. I think too, one of the really nice things is just kind of, building in, I have something and we can kind of be in the moment together. So sort of that joint attention piece, and then the back and forth, and just really building on that is really the kind of the beginning steps. And then being able to pause or model if you have a communication device is going to be extremely important, because then you get that association of, something happens or someone says something and then I am supposed to respond in some way. And so for the parent or caregiver or teacher, whoever, to work on and model that. And then always I always say respond to any communication attempts, right? So that I know when I do something, even if it's a sign or a gesture or so forth, or an approximation, that I'm getting something in return that is hopefully what I want, and is motivating. So if it's something that I'm gesturing or I'm doing something and I don't yet have the words, modeling that for them and then making sure that they receive whatever it is that is motivating that they're requesting is going to really help to build on those skills in order to get, further where you can kind of comment and use conversational skills in whatever mode that communication system is.
And Stephanie, aren't there past lunch and learns that address some of these skills?
Yeah, so I think there was one, there are a couple that I can think of early on. I know that I worked on one, that we worked on one kind of working on that serve and return. What are some different games that you can kind of do? How do you expand on language and so forth? And so that one I believe was in June. So I think it was like June 7th, if you look in the archived sections. So, and it's an area that you have to build on those skills. And we talked about the complexities of language and how you can still work on whether it's modeling and that reciprocation, joint attention, all those skills that really go into language, both whether it's verbal, but or also those nonverbal things. So.
Oh, that's very helpful. You made a really good point too. It's hard to believe we've been doing this since June. The lunch and learns have become very popular. So yeah, going into the archive and looking at some of the library has just really grown of the archives for the lunch and learns. So just another great resource. Well, if we don't have any more questions, a number of people had said, thank you, Steph and Charlene. You guys did a great session here. We really look forward to your evaluation. We really want to pay attention to that. We really value your feedback. And September 24th, we'll have parent reinforcement and child preferences. And that will be by Teresa and Emily. So thank you very much for your time. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.